fall with our fall fellow, Nancy Bocskor. We're very excited to have Nancy here. She and I both will regret the following statement, but we've known each other longer than either of us will admit, so don't ask us to. And we've had a lot of experience together, and so she approached me 2 years ago? 2 years ago about potentially being a fellow, and she submitted a proposal, and it was on training women to be involved in democracy and activists and everything. And so it was very, very personally exciting to me. So we're delighted to have her here. She is going to be here for 7 weeks, leading discussions with fascinating guests, and I'll let you introduce your guest in a moment. But I just wanted to come out and tell you a little bit about our history and tell you how excited I am to have her here this fall, and to please join me in welcoming her as our fall fellow. So.
I sold my house in Arlington, Virginia, moved my car, moved me, gave my niece the best birthday gift I could, which was downsizing about 80%, and moved to Denton, Texas, after almost 39 years in Washington, D.C. I feel so strongly about civic engagement, political participation. I keep seeing it lacking. We just don't have the civics I grew up with. And Texas Women's University in Denton received funding to open an Institute for Women's Leadership. I had heard about it, they approached me, I applied, and I have been launching their new Center for Women in Politics and Public Policy. So I have to thank TWU for allowing me, they said, is there any reason you would not take this job? And I said, well, I'm supposed to be a Dole Fellow. Will you let me commute like 7 or 8 times to Kansas? And they said, well, certainly. So I'm very grateful that they're letting me disappear for 24 hours at a time. But I really see this whole series has come about, before I introduce my lovely guest. I have worked in 28 countries, and when I would go overseas, whether it was at the invitation of a U.S. embassy, a university, a private group, I would look around and I would talk about what we had as Americans that I see lacking. And so I created a speech in Moldova. It is a country, I'm not just making it up. It's over between Russia, Ukraine, and Romania. And I created a speech 5 or 6 years ago talking about you have to have trust, transparency, and tithing, that giving back. And all of a sudden, we have had such a turbulent time in politics, I started giving the speech that I created for former Soviet republics in America to remind Americans. Let me tell you what a real war on women looks like, because I have seen it in many countries and have experienced it through my mentees. So this is just the perfect topic. So I'm delighted to be here, and it is also very moving for me because when I was a sophomore in college, I had an internship with the Ford Dole campaign. And I only took one course on campus, and I spent the entire fall organizing events for the children of the Doles, or Robin Dole actually came to my campus, Otterbein University, and it was the first time I did an ice cream social, and that has been a standard in my political life for 40-some years. Have an ice cream social, it makes everybody happy. And I just trooped all around Ohio as a sophomore organizing rallies for the campaign. So being in this room the first time when I came to visit is very meaningful because, well, some of this just looks like our dorm room sophomore year. And my friends still remember me dialing 224 FORD, which was the phone number. Yes, 40 years later, they remember me being obsessed. But it's a delight and an honor to be here. My first guest in our series is Farhat Popal, who is the Senior Program Manager for the Women's Initiative at the George W. Bush Presidential Center, which is near SMU's campus and in Dallas. And our paths crossed a couple of years ago. Of course, a friend in the international space introduced us. And in fact, I met Farhat even before I had decided to take the job in Dallas. So everything that we're watching right now with Afghanistan, the war that never ends. And Farhat, I'm going to talk to you today and about how did you end up here? Because I know that you were born in Afghanistan.
I was. Yes, absolutely. So I was born in Kabul, Afghanistan, the capital, in the mid-1980s during the Soviet War. And as you can imagine, it was a difficult time to be there, and my family had the good fortune to be able to leave. My mother likes to say that I was born and I breathed the air and then we left. So I was 3 weeks old when we left Afghanistan. And we spent a couple of months in India, registered with the United Nations there as refugees, and ended up in Germany, where two of my mother's brothers had fled to before us. And so I spent a few years in Germany, went to actual kindergarten there, but unfortunately was too young to remember German because I was between 5 and 6 years old when we moved to the United States. So I half grew up in West Palm Beach, Florida, and half grew up in San Diego, California. I went to high school and college and graduate school in California. So typically when people ask me, where are you from? I ask them, do you want the long version or the short version? And the short version is California. The long version is Afghanistan.
This long journey.
Yes.
Now, you've been back to Afghanistan. Do you still have relatives there?
I do. I have relatives on my father's side, but everyone on my mother's side has actually left since. So we're sort of scattered about, as many populations who flee war and conflict are. So I have family in the United States. I have family in Canada. We have family in Sweden, Germany. We have sort of extended family in Australia. We're kind of all over the place. But again, that's a function of one of the largest refugee populations in the world. So I don't know if you all know this, but Afghans have made up the largest refugee population in the world for, I want to say, at least 2 to 3 decades. And it was only during the Syrian conflict that Syrians began to outnumber Afghans in terms of refugees. So it's been 4 decades, unfortunately, that Afghans have been fleeing the violence and instability in Afghanistan.
And before I forget, Farhat was kind enough to stop by KJHK, as in KJ Hawk. Got that pretty fast. And tonight our interview is going to be on at 7 p.m., and that's 90.7 on your dial. Thank you for stopping by there. As you know, most recently I moderated a panel at the Texas Lyceum, which is a think tank conference, public affairs group in Texas. And it was called, Are We Taking Our Democracy for Granted? And I was on a panel with one of Farhat's colleagues who had escaped North Korea. His father was murdered when he was 12. He was home, just an orphan. Someday he hopes he will run into his sister in China, and that's why he's learning Chinese, but she just disappeared. We had a colleague from Venezuela and then a friend of ours who has worked in Iran, and our particular panel was life without a democracy, because we hear so much today with income just inequality. People are looking at, maybe democracy is out of date, maybe we need socialism or communism or something like that. And I think the panel we had, and I'm talking to you about this, it was so riveting. In fact, the story of the young man from North Korea, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. Someone had to go get my purse and get the Kleenex out of the purse, and we're like passing it down between my colleague Miriam and myself, because it was such an emotional story of just not having anything. Mm-hmm. So tell me, and you were very young, but you've worked there, what is life like in this? Again, it goes back, there's no trust. You can't trust anyone. You could be murdered. People have, security guards at all times. How do people survive in this?
I mean, it's an incredibly difficult situation to be in. And I think for Afghans who have endured 4 decades of war, the sense of resiliency is something that, you know, when Afghans hear, oh, but you're resilient and you endure and all of these things, their response these days has been, well, yes, because we have to be resilient, because what's the alternative? The alternative is despair. And once you fall into that, that sense of hopelessness takes over. So yes, Afghan women and Afghans in general have been resilient over the last 4 decades, but I think it's important to remember, you know, what the Taliban era was like, because I think that is a good kind of microcosm of what life is like without democracy, but also just access to political, social, economic life that women endured. I mean, they were essentially invisible. They weren't allowed to leave the home without a male escort. They were banned from gaining an education. They were banned from employment. They were essentially prohibited from accessing health care. And so for Afghan women who were not used to that type of life, I mean, when you look at Afghanistan, before the Taliban, before the civil war prior to that, before the Soviet invasion, the Afghanistan of the 1950s, 60s, and early 70s was very different. My mom was a journalist in Afghanistan. She was also the editor of a children's magazine. And she had to give up that profession when we left. She was in her 40s when we came to the United States. One of my aunts was a math and science teacher. My other aunt was a physical education teacher, very athletic. I mean, these were normal lives that they lived, and it was in relative peace and relative stability. They went to the movies on Friday nights with their friends. I mean, again, that's kind of that was their existence in the capital, and I'm sure that you know, rural areas had a different existence, but that was what they knew. And so you contrast that with what happened to Afghan women during the Taliban era, and it is just, you can imagine what it must feel like to have that freedom and that access, and then suddenly have that taken away from you. But over the course of the last 18 years, Afghan women have made significant achievements, and particularly in access to political life. I mean, during the 2009 presidential elections, 2 Afghan women ran for president. You have women in sort of provincial councils, in local government at the most kind of local level, grassroots level, all the way up to ministers of key departments as part of the cabinet. And so all of that progress is immense, and Afghan women today, I'm sure that you've seen this in the news recently over the course of the last few months with news of the U.S. Taliban kind of peace talks, but Afghan women essentially say we refuse to go back. We refuse to go back to a time where we didn't have that access. We weren't able to be a part of the fledgling democracy that Afghanistan has become. And I think that's important for all of us to remember. And for me, that gives me hope, and I hope that gives Afghans hope as well.
Yes, I always see that the women, because they're the ones, I once called it passion-driven leadership, that a great challenge or loss in a community really propels women to say, okay, I have to step up. And I think we've certainly seen that with many of the women I've met from Afghanistan, and whether it is creating jobs or educating other women. And it goes back to that resiliency, but I also think it's survival. And I don't think a lot of people understand what every day is like when it's just surviving.
Right.
I think that's quite challenging. One of the other points, you know, when we go overseas, and you've worked in many places, and we'll talk more about that, I always ask women in particular, what is the #1 issue facing your community? And it's always corruption. And then we have to have the conversation, okay, it's like peeling back the onion. Well, what does corruption mean? And it can mean the government says the water's drinkable, and it's not. Or everything is paid under the table. You can't have any services without paying someone off. What does that look like today? Is the corruption what we read is still rampant. Is it just make everyday life? And there's the old saying, add women, change everything. Are we seeing that when we get more women involved, that this corruption decreases?
I think we definitely see that in Afghanistan. I mean, I think something that Mrs. Ghani, President Ghani's wife, a point that she made that has really kind of resonated with me is that when it comes to corruption, you can either prosecute every person who has ever taken a bribe, be it the lowest level public servant to the highest level public official, or you can try to change the system to disincentivize corruption. And if it's the latter, then that takes time, and it takes commitment, it takes patience, it takes focusing on democratic institutions and good governance and rule of law. It takes access to justice and being able to implement those rules and regulations in society. So all of that takes time, and I think women are making a difference. As you know, Nancy, research shows that when women are politically empowered and they participate in that way, corruption does go down. They do have an impact on good governance, and society sees that. There have been polls where they've basically shown that people trust women politicians more than they trust male politicians. When it comes to things like bribery and corruption and doing what's best for their constituents and the local community. So I think you multiply that on a national scale and it absolutely will make a difference. It takes time, and it takes access to those positions of power. I think that's something we also don't really talk a lot about. We talk about capacity building, we talk about training, and yes, all of that is important for people who don't traditionally have access to those types of resources or skills or knowledge. But once you've been trained up to a certain point, there's only so much you can do if you don't have access to those positions of power to be able to influence policy, to be able to influence government decisions. And so I think from a development perspective, we need to talk about both of those things at an equal level. You need the training and the capacity, but you also need that access.
I certainly know that when we look at Rwanda, which is the #1 country in the world for women's political participation, they first, a couple of things happened. There was a genocide, and a lot of the men died, but they also, and families, but then you had a quota system, and they showed that women, out of the 100, it worked so well that now, the last time I looked, 67 of the 100 members of the legislature in Rwanda are women. And that was, triple or more of what the quota was. And it goes back to looking at the world in a little bit different way. Tell me, I can't remember, is there a quota system in Afghanistan like there is in Iraq and other places?
Yes, there is. And I think it's important for sort of post-conflict societies. I don't know if Afghanistan qualifies as post-conflict at this point, but those quota systems are incredibly important. Like we were talking about access just now. In order for women to have access to those positions in an environment where they traditionally maybe didn't have that access, quota systems are important for getting them in. But it's up to the women once they're in to influence policy, to be able to impact those decisions that are made in pursuit of better governance. And I think, for Afghanistan, the capacity building part is there, but there needs to be a bit more of that. I think, there have been studies that show that Afghan politicians and members of parliament currently, they recognize in themselves kind of the capacity that they're lacking and areas where they need that additional training. And I think it's courageous of them to be able to be honest about that and say, we want to do our jobs better, and this is what we need to be able to do that. But I will say, I think over the long term, once women get there and they sort of have that impact and that influence, I think over time the need for that quota system is reduced. It sounds like in Rwanda, they likely don't need that quota
No, they don't.
anymore because society sees the impact of having them as a part of that political process. So my hope is that someday Afghanistan won't need a quota system for women to be involved. But
Yes, I like to say that in so many countries, they didn't grow up with 7th grade student council election
Right.
like we did, right? When we look at what does capacity mean, it's even the Sally Ride quote, you can't be what you don't see. And I certainly have worked with a lot of women that have never seen another woman leader, or what does that even look like? And I think that's part of what all these programs in capacity building, as we talk about it, as we train women, just even what a leader looks like, right?
absolutely.
As we, and in the whole quota system, people ask, because the United States is so low on women's political participation with the World Economic Forum. It had dropped, at one point it was 78th. I think we've dropped farther, unfortunately. And a lot of people, why don't we have a quota system here? And I think it's just difficult here because we don't really like quotas. We want a meritocracy. Although we sometimes wonder, okay, do we, after the whole college scandal where people are paying for their kids to get into University of Southern California, I think it's really shaken the whole trust level. So I think that it's made a big difference to give women that voice in Afghanistan. I just am always conflicted because there are a lot of women that think we should have a quota system here. But to your point, we are here. We just have to encourage more women. We have that opportunity. We don't have doors shut, correct?
Right. Absolutely. And I think the more women we see, I mean, I will say, as a woman of color, the most recent congressional elections, gave me hope because there are so many women who have entered Congress, and we have more women of color in Congress. And to be able to point to someone and say, oh, well, if she can do it, then maybe I can do it too. I think that's really powerful.
That's right, and we don't have the barriers here that these women do in other countries, and I think a lot of American women forget that, or my vote isn't important. I'm going, yeah, it's the most powerful thing you do, and since the non-voters decided the 2016 election, you cannot complain if you do not step up. And here, men, women have been dying just to vote. I remember during the Taliban, when the women and men would use the blue ink to vote with their fingers, and the Taliban actually cut people's fingers off because they actually did vote.
Yes. And those stories get out, and Afghans hear them, and yet they still go out to vote. The next presidential election is happening this Saturday, and I saw an article just yesterday from women who recognize the risks that they would be facing because the Taliban have said again that they will disrupt the elections. They've told Afghans to stay away from the polls. And the story was about these women who have said, I refuse to give up my right, and I refuse to allow that fear to dictate my political participation. So if you think about that just in terms of our experience here, do we ever think that we're going to potentially lose our life if we go vote? No. So to think about, again, the courage and the resilience and the drive that it takes to make that decision, I think, that's something to remember.
So tell us a little bit about your career path. You are plucked out of Afghanistan, you're going to Germany, you end up in Florida, then in California, and you went to college in California and had your master's there. You've worked in Washington, D.C. Tell me what your path was and how did you get so involved to go, and one day you're in California, next thing, oh, I'm going to go to Washington, D.C. Yeah. Tell us what led that.
Sure. No. So I was a political science major in undergrad, focused on international relations, did my minor in history of the Middle East, and I thought, okay, well, I have an undergraduate degree, but how likely is it that I'm going to get hired straight out of undergrad? And so in order to kind of expand my set of skills, I did my master's in public policy. And a lot of public policy programs focus on quantitative methods, on microeconomics, and they give you sort of some tangible skills that I thought would be helpful. So for my internship between my first and second year, I actually worked at the city of San Diego, and I was lucky enough that at the end of the internship, they said, so you're graduating in a year, do you want to come back? And I said, well, that would be interesting, sure. So I knew that I'd be back in San Diego working for local government right after graduate school. And about a year and a half into it, I thought, this is interesting, and it's giving me some good work experience and background, and I'm meeting fantastic people. I worked in a great office, but my passion has always been in international relations. And being from Afghanistan, I always felt this sense of responsibility that I've had the amazing fortune to grow up here, to be able to go to school here. My access to education was never an impediment. There was never a barrier to that. I just had to work hard. And so I didn't want to take that for granted. And I thought, I have this education, I have this experience, and I want to be able to use it in service of others. So I took 2 networking trips to Washington, D.C. when I was still in California. And I essentially started by reaching out to my grad school friends who I knew had either worked in D.C. or had connections there. And before I knew it, the sort of networking tree and branches started to grow. So I reached out to maybe 3 or 4, and each grad school friend gave me 1 or 2 contacts in Washington, D.C. that they thought would be helpful. So after that, I would reach out to them via email or phone call. We would connect, and after a couple of months of doing that, I thought, okay, I have a good list of people that would be helpful to actually meet in person. So I went out for 2 trips. Each of them was maybe 2.5 days. I remember for one of them, I had scheduled 9 informational interviews in the span of 2.5 days. And it was during the second of those networking trips that I arrived on a Monday morning. I had an informational interview with an alumni of my grad program who was at the State Department in a completely unrelated office, but he was kind enough to meet with me, and he told me about this temporary federal agency that had recently been established called the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, or SIGAR for short. And so he said, have you heard of this? And I said, no. So he literally just printed out the website of the organization for me, handed it over, and said, well, think about it. I said, okay. The next day, I had another informational interview with someone who was working on Capitol Hill. And I just happened to mention SIGAR in passing to him, and he said, oh, well, I know someone in that office. Let me send them your resume. Mind you, this was at like 4 p.m. So he sends my resume to them that evening, and the next morning I get a phone call from their office secretary basically saying, hey, we got your resume, and we'd be interested in talking to you. Do you have time to come to the office at 1 p.m.? And so I'm looking at my schedule, and I had like 1 informational interview at 11 and another at like 2 o'clock, and I'm trying to decide, okay, do I go, do I not go? And I thought, you know what? Let's try to make this happen. So hopped in a cab, went over there, and I thought I was just meeting with the secretary, and it turns out it was basically a 20-minute job interview with the head of that office. And at the end of it, he said, well, we're interested in you, so let us know, ball's in your court. And I walked out and I thought, what in the world just happened? So this was an agency that two days ago I didn't even know existed, and I walked out with a job offer, and that, I mean, that has really influenced kind of my path, because if I hadn't taken that chance, I wouldn't have gotten to do Afghanistan-related work. I mean, if you think about it, I went from doing local government at the city of San Diego to working for a federal agency that evaluated the efficiency and effectiveness of development projects in Afghanistan, and it was that sort of technical skill set from working in the auditor's office, doing performance audits at the city, that I was able to translate over to federal government auditing. And that experience exposed me to being able to travel to Afghanistan, working at the U.S. Embassy there on various trips. I was with SIGAR for 3.5 years. Because of that Afghanistan experience, I was able to get a job with the State Department working on South and Central Asia. So my portfolio was human rights programs in Afghanistan and the 5 Central Asian countries.
And let's review those, because I think everyone needs to know their stand countries.
Yes, so you have Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan. Those 5.
And Turkmenistan is the bottom of the list on human rights.
Turkmenistan is probably the most. It's right next to North Korea in terms of totalitarianism. It's an odd place. If you ever Google Turkmenistan, you'll see there's capital Ashgabat is just this mass of white marble, but you'll see no people on the streets. So it's an interesting place.
Did you get to visit the other countries?
I actually went to Tajikistan.
Okay.
Yes, which was also really interesting. So in Afghanistan, there are 2 major languages. There's Dari and Pashto, and Dari is essentially a dialect of Farsi or Persian. And there's 3 countries in the world that speak some dialect of that. You have Iran that speaks Farsi/Persian, Afghanistan that speaks Dari, and then Tajikistan where they speak Tajiki, which is, again, just a dialect of Persian or Farsi. And it was mind-blowing to me because since it's a former Soviet republic, they write in the Cyrillic alphabet, but it's a similar language. So for a brief period of time, I thought maybe I could learn Russian, and I started taking some Russian classes. That was a bad idea. But I did learn the alphabet enough to be able to read some of the street signs in Tajikistan, and I was like, wait a minute, this is the weirdest thing. And I would hear people speaking Tajiki, and it sounded like a combination of Russian and Dari kind of mixed all together. So it was an interesting experience.
So tell me a little bit more about when you went to Afghanistan, when you were auditing these projects, because we certainly have all read in the paper that, you heard in the media that we send all this money and it goes into other people's pockets. How do you even manage that? I mean, how does that work? And especially with your background, I mean, that was just perfect with the whole auditing skills. Yeah. Bless you. I trooped through accounting 1 and 2, and that was the extent of my accounting background. So auditing would have been just just a non-starter for me. Yeah. So tell me a little bit about how do you even, because there's so much money, there's so much corruption, how do you even manage in a situation where, I don't even know what the banking's, I mean, at some point, there's not, the banks doesn't mean that, putting money in a bank doesn't mean it's going to stay there. So tell me how you dealt with that.
Yeah, well, most of our work was more performance auditing than financial auditing. So we would, again, look at the effectiveness and efficiency of programs. So are they meeting their original program objectives? Are they doing it within time and cost requirements? And so each project was approximately nine months to a year, if you include all of the time required to do field work, do all of the interviews, do data analysis and collection, write the report, which usually is upwards of 50 plus pages. But I think what was really important for me was doing that work in Afghanistan itself. It's one thing to be sitting at a desk in Washington, D.C., kind of looking at these documents and making assessments, and it's another to use that information, but also see the context in which that data is collected and where it comes from and what the constraints are. And there are so many. I mean, for a long time, the U.S. Embassy, you had folks from USAID, you have folks obviously from the State Department, you have diplomats there, and people from a slew of other U.S. government agencies, and it's incredibly difficult to get outside of the wire and to actually do proper management and oversight of U.S. government-funded projects, because if you're a USAID program manager and you're managing a project that's 4 provinces away, but the security situation is so unstable that you can't get there to actually see physically with your eyes what's being built and what's not being built, that has an impact on management and oversight. And so the calculus then is how much risk are we willing to tolerate in order to be able to properly oversee some of these projects. And it's not an easy calculus to make, and especially, I mean, I was there. My first trip to Afghanistan as part of my work with SIGAR was in August of 2011, and the first attack on the U.S. Embassy happened in September of 2011. And that, I think, really impacted our risk tolerance and therefore our management and oversight capacity. And that makes it hard. It makes it really hard to properly address things like corruption or mismanagement or, abuse of funds.
So do you then have people 4 provinces away? Do you pay for them to come to the U.S. Embassy, take photos? I mean, how do you, when you can't be there, boots on the ground and looking at things, how do you cope with that?
I mean, third-party monitoring has been used. So you'll contract sort of local entities or local kind of monitoring and evaluation teams to be able to go, and essentially you hire people who are able to go to places where you can't go, and they collect the data for you, they collect the information for you, and you just have to trust that they're trustworthy and they're giving you accurate information, and you go from there.
Can you tell us about a program that you thought was effective? Tell me a little bit about some of the programs that you then had to assess and what were they? Just tell us a little bit. I know, is it a water? Tell us what those were.
I mean, I think for the most part, sort of a generalization, but I think programs that are the most effective are those that are aligned with local level priorities and policies. Where we get into trouble is when we sort of go in with our own idea of what would be effective or what people need, rather than actually listening to them and trying to address what their needs and priorities are. So, and that could be anything. I mean, it could be a women's rights program, it could be a water project, it could be physical infrastructure, it could be other types of infrastructure, but I think the ones that are the most effective are the ones that are aligned in that way.
So you're working at this agency. What was the next step? How did you? Was the next step State Department or?
Yeah, the next step was the State Department. My role was to essentially monitor human rights developments in my 6 portfolio countries and to help develop projects and programs that sought to address those human rights challenges. On top of that, it involved monitoring and evaluation. So once a specific non-governmental organization was chosen to implement a specific project, we would work with that organization to make sure that we were addressing any challenges they had, kind of problem solving along the way, and really making sure that the program was achieving its objectives. It was incredibly interesting, as you can imagine, not a little, but quite emotionally draining at times, because if all you're reading about all day is human rights abuses, perpetrated against different populations, that definitely takes a toll on you, and you attempt to develop kind of good coping mechanisms and ways to manage that impact. But it also allows you to really make sure that you don't take anything for granted here with regard to our political system, our access to different opportunities, and even just not being subjected to human rights abuses for the most trivial, menial things.
I know that the Uzbek government is working very hard in Washington, D.C. I have been to their embassy numerous times for briefings. And I was supposed to go on a trip there, but there was a little bit of a snafu. But I was getting briefed by someone from Georgetown that was his expertise. And of course, doing this work, intellectuals, everyone, because cotton is such an issue, and that is their big crop. Yet to get it harvested, they enslave people. I mean, they basically say you're not teaching school, you're not at the university, and they really conscript people. And so, tell us. I mean, did you deal with that? And is that a major? Or, what else? That was just something I always read about in Uzbekistan.
Yes, I mean that's definitely one of the
slavery. I mean, it's just
yes. One of the major kind of human rights abuses that Uzbekistan is known for. I have heard recently that they're attempting to address that challenge. I don't know how effective they've been at doing that, but it's always a part of I think the Trafficking in Persons report. It's always a part of human rights developments that are monitored and sort of kept up with. So,
tell us about some of the. You don't have to be specific, but just some of the special challenges women have to face, not just in Afghanistan with human rights, but some of these other, as I like to call them, stand countries.
Yeah.
And how is that? I know it's particularly brutal, but what are just some of the rights that we have that just are unheard of in some of these other places?
Well, I think one issue that we work on specifically at the Bush Institute through our We Lead program, which is a leadership development and economic training program, is women's economic empowerment and women's leadership in the economy. And so I think something we don't really think about is the immense barriers that women face just in being able to participate in the economy. There are 104 countries that restrict the types of jobs that women can have, which is an incredible number. And there are things like, they're not just based in these countries. In Russia, women can't steer a ship or drive a train. I think in Kazakhstan, women can't skin cattle. In Argentina, women can't distill or sell alcohol. I mean, these are very interesting kind of rules and regulations that you don't really think about that impact women's access to the economy. In terms of property rights and land rights, I mean, that's an immense challenge that women face. In many Muslim-majority countries, unfortunately, women's access to inheritance is severely restricted. And so if you're a woman who, in theory, should have that right, should have that access, but you're not able to take advantage of that, what does that mean for your economic future? Women, I think I read a statistic recently that in terms of kind of the global average, 58% of women have bank accounts, which is not that large of a number. That's just over half of women in the world have a bank account. And there are countries that restrict that access, right? You have to have a husband's permission or a father's permission or whatever the case may be. I believe it was in Texas that until, I think, 1967, married women couldn't own property. Yes. These are all, I mean, they're not specific to certain countries or certain regions of the world. They're global, and I think we really need to focus on that as much as we focus on political participation, as much as we focus on kind of women's leadership in general or their access to education and healthcare. This is all a part of gender equality, right? Gender equality is not one specific issue. It's a myriad number of issues that all influence each other and that are all linked in so many different ways. Women's health and access to reproductive services impacts their economic empowerment. All of these things, I think, are
it's all interrelated.
It's all interrelated.
And a lot of people try to separate it on, oh no, we don't have these issues.
Right.
So you're at State Department. How did you end up at the Bush Center where we first met? And we were talking earlier about how we wanted to launch this We Lead program, but you were brought in to see what have we been doing in the past and what can we do to improve this. And so if you can share a little bit about, I was very excited. I met, how many women did you have this year?
We had 18.
18 women from Afghanistan,
Egypt.
Jordan, Egypt,
Tunisia,
and Lebanon. And they all were part of almost a year, but where they received mentorship, and they all had a project, and I was there for the last day when they presented their advocacy or business plan, and it was really an extraordinary day. It was such a proud moment for these women to find their voice up on that stage when they were presenting. Tell us a little bit about that. And I don't know if a lot of people, when we think of Laura Bush, we think of literacy. But she has just been a huge advocate for women in the Middle East and in North Africa to help with this economic empowerment, but also just leadership skills. So tell them, everybody, about what you were doing with that.
Definitely. So I had been in DC for about 5.5 years, and as I mentioned, my family's in California, and I thought, this is just too far. So when the opportunity arose to come to Texas, I was excited to be kind of halfway, halfway there. This opportunity was also really the only place in Dallas where I could continue doing this type of work with women from the Middle East, North Africa, and Afghanistan specifically, and work on women's rights and issues that I care very deeply about. So when I started the position, I actually was doing a strategic review of the sort of previous iteration of the We Lead program that was called the Women's Initiative Fellowship. And at the time, it was focused mainly in Egypt and Tunisia, and we focused on one country at a time. And it was a leadership development program primarily. So all of the kind of skills that you would think of, managing teams, managing conflict, negotiation, interesting site visits and speakers and that sort of thing. They traveled all over the United States for a good 4 or 5 weeks. And so we, after about 4 iterations of that program, 2 cohorts from Egypt and 2 from Tunisia, my role was really to look at, kind of what was going well, were there opportunities to make a bigger impact, and so I worked on that review for about a year, and the result of that was to turn it into a multi-country program, because so many of the economies in the Middle East and North Africa face similar challenges when it comes to high unemployment rates, large youth populations, limited access for women to the economy. And so we thought, what if we could continue doing this great leadership development work and also combine it with an attempt to support women who are working to address some of these very real, kind of tangible challenges in their countries. And so as a result of all of that, we ended up adding Lebanon, Afghanistan, Jordan, and Morocco as well, actually, to the group, even though we unfortunately didn't have any Moroccan participants this time around. And we opened it up to women who are advancing economic opportunity in their countries. So they could be doing that in a variety of ways, whether that's trying to bridge the gap between education levels and actual employment opportunities in the market, to promoting entrepreneurship and removing some of the barriers to business creation in some of these countries, to economic policy reform and advocacy, to women who were focused on empowering women in rural areas economically, because they face such unique challenges. And I think it has been a success. So this past March, we actually graduated our first cohort from this multi-country model. And they've been just an exceptional and brilliant group of women, as Nancy mentioned. We have one woman, one of our Egyptian scholars, she started her own human resources and recruitment sort of consultancy firm in Egypt, in Alexandria, 20 years ago. And this year, she's been building that up, and this year she actually held the largest job fair that saw 80,000 job seekers come through, which is incredible when you think about it. One of our Jordanian scholars, she, during the day, she works for an international development organization, and in the evening, in her spare time, she's started her own kind of social enterprise. She hires, or is planning to hire, women in rural areas who do kind of traditional embroidery, and she's working to economically empower them as kind of her side project. We have another Tunisian scholar who started a kids entrepreneurship lab. Part of her effort to kind of advance economic opportunity is to try to promote a culture of entrepreneurship from a very young age, because so many of these countries have large public sectors. And so when young people graduate from school, they expect a government job. But when you focus on one sector, you're not enhancing, you're not promoting economic growth. And so her effort is to try to teach young kids innovation and entrepreneurship, and to kind of build that over time so that when these kids graduate, they have a larger kind of worldview and mindset about what's possible for them and what could be interesting for them. So those are just three of our scholars, and you sort of multiply that over the 18 scholars in the program and then the alumni in the program. That's essentially our model. Is we don't have offices in these countries. We don't have kind of specific solutions for how they should do these things, because that's not our goal. Our goal is to give them kind of the leadership development skills, the network in terms of meeting their fellow scholars who are facing a lot of these same challenges, and get them in a room together so that they can talk about how they've worked to address some of these challenges, what's worked, what hasn't worked, and how can they use that moving forward. They're the ones that have the solutions, not us. But what we can do is to convene them, to help them kind of see things in a way that maybe they hadn't before, give them access to interesting speakers and kind of social enterprises in the United States and what has worked for them. So we've been really fortunate to get to meet all of these incredible women. They're so inspiring, and on days when you sort of feel down about the world, that's who you look to, and you're like, all right, she's doing great work, and I feel better about the world because of it. So.
Well, I remember meeting the woman who was actually going to New York for her textile.
Yes.
And
yes.
the most beautiful textiles, and she had been selected by a firm in New York to exhibit the work. And I think she was from Egypt,
She was from Egypt, yes.
And I mean, imagine you're in Egypt one day, and the next thing, oh, I'm going to New York City basically for Fashion Week, right? And it just, you provide such opportunity. And I think one of the things that was very important to them is that the President and Mrs. Bush spent time with them. And so here they are, barely able to, in many places, they have no voice. It's very repressive. And the next thing you know, you're in Dallas having dinner with President and Mrs. Bush. And you could just see the glee on their faces on, I can't believe this is happening to me. And so it's just such joy.
Yeah.
We're going to open it up for some questions, I believe. And before we go, tell us something that your family or you, when you came to America, what was the most surprising thing about America? You were obviously very little, but what was so surprising to them, even though they had family here? I always like to see, okay, they just were amazed.
Yeah. I remember when we moved from Florida to California, we were just amazed and a little overwhelmed by just the highway system and the number of highways that you needed to take to get to wherever it was you were going, and how fast the cars were moving. I think that was something that was probably overwhelming, and just kind of learning how to drive. My family way back in the day had a tiny Volkswagen Bug in Afghanistan, but you can imagine the roads were nothing like the roads in the United States. So I think the driving part was probably something that was overwhelming.
Great. All right. Do we have some questions? Yes, and we have the mic. If you could introduce yourself, please.
Hi, I'm Brooklyn Helwig. I'm a freshman here at KU, and I was just wondering, as you're familiar with economic upstart within the Middle East and more not necessarily underdeveloped, but where women don't have as many economic opportunities or access to these things. I assume that you're familiar with the institution of microloaning in these countries.
Yeah.
Would you say that that's a detriment in terms of high levels of interest and other things like that, or do you think microloaning actually has hope to give women the economic upstart that they need?
That's a great question. I think that's one potential solution that needs to be combined with a number of other interventions, right? Microloans are great in very specific contexts where you have women who traditionally have been marginalized, had zero access, and this is kind of their in to be able to start kind of a tiny business of their own, potentially grow that, but also just use it as supplemental income or, you know, a part of their livelihood. But that's a specific target group, right? What about the university graduate who has a bachelor's degree or a master's degree or a doctorate but can't find a job, which is the case in a lot of Middle Eastern countries today. It's interesting because in a lot of Middle Eastern countries, women's education levels are very high. But it's the access to the jobs that is difficult, and it's not just for women. Obviously, you know, men face this challenge as well, and that's why these economies have so many issues. But I do think that you really need a variety of interventions to address all of the barriers that women have at every level, not just, I mean, at the most grassroots level, but also at the highest level.
I think I saw a hand over here. Maybe not. Anyone else? Yes, ma'am. And please, we met you earlier, but we'll let you introduce yourself to everyone else.
Yeah, Diana Carlin. I'm a retired faculty member here in political communication, and I've done a lot of work in about 11 countries with women, including Afghanistan. And I'm curious, I guess it's been, my last trip there was about 4 years ago, but based on all of your evaluations of the programs you've done, and if you have a limited amount of money, hypothetical, and you could only spend it in 2 or 3 areas, where would you have the most impact with programs right now?
Oh, that's a tough one. I mean, I think you have to keep focusing on women because research shows that when you focus on women and you empower women, that improves society as a whole, right? When women are educated and healthy, their children are more likely to be educated and healthy. When women participate politically, you're more likely to have good governance and less corruption. When women are educated, they have better access to employment opportunities, which then advances economic growth in a country. So I think because of that, we do need to still focus on Afghan women. There are still so many challenges that they face, and they're really, it's an uphill battle for them, but they've made so much progress over the last 18 years, and I feel confident that they'll still stand up for those rights and keep fighting for them, but they're paving a path that's treacherous for them to be on. They face risks of violence, they face assassination, they face actual, life and death instances, and so they're changing society by doing the work that they're doing that they're doing, but it comes at a cost and a risk. So all of that to say, we should absolutely continue to work on women's issues. I think continuing to enhance the capacity of the Afghan government is really important when it comes to democratic institutions, when it comes to rule of law, in terms of kind of access to justice mechanisms. All of these things are really important. And, Afghanistan's first kind of democratic elections were back in 2004, and when you think about it, that's not that long ago. That's 15 years. Before that, you had civil war, you had the presidential republic that ended up being taken over by communists, you had a monarchy that was relatively stable and attempted to implement some reforms, but this is Afghanistan's first kind of foray into actual democracy, and it needs help. It just needs help to be able to do that effectively, and that's to be expected. I think we have to manage our expectations that there is only so much that you can achieve during a short period of time. And when you look at kind of the history of countries, 15 to 18 years is not a long time, especially when you consider that Afghanistan's been at war for the last 4 decades. So it's been rebuilding for less than half the time that it was being destroyed, when you think about it that way. So that focus on institutions for long-term sustainability, I think, is very important. What would be the third one, Nancy? What do you think?
Well, I think that we often see governing is so much different than when you demonstrate and you're an activist, right? And the best activists
Yes.
are not the people who are governing. And so I think it's two different skill sets. So I think you're going to have to train women to find their voice. How do you become an activist? How do you work to make sure there's clean water in your village, or that women can birth in a birth hospital and not in a hut? So I think you have that, but that is a different kind of activism than, okay, the day-to-day, let's just say, the nuts and bolts of governing a country. And oftentimes when we see those activists try to govern, that's difficult. And I think we've seen that in many places. Egypt comes to mind.
Right.
And so I think that this capacity building is, how do you make the trains run on time, right? It's just, that is a whole different thing to look at. And I don't always know if we spend enough time on that part.
Right. You definitely need both, right?
Right.
You need the people who will govern, and you need the people who will hold government accountable.
Correct.
To make sure that works effectively and efficiently over the long term, and you have people who are kind of there watching, making sure that you're not corrupt, you are
Right.
governing effectively. So you need both of those kind of groups in society.
So there's that.
Popal, check with me.
So do we have another question? This side is very quiet. And your name?
Yes, hi, good afternoon. My name is Francisco. I'm a Lawrence resident. Well, first, thank you both for sharing your experiences and the great work that you do to promote women's empowerment and leadership, certainly. I would like to ask you if you can both maybe share with us, maybe the other side of this coin is, how receptive have men been in these different areas that you work in when you bring up the issue and work with women leadership or advocacy? Are they generally receptive, or is there enough real buy-in, or is there some kind of a pushback? What have you both experienced in this?
I'll let you lead on that, and then I'll.
Well, I think with any type of women's empowerment programming, you have to include men in the conversation, because otherwise that misconceptions kind of arise. You potentially have resentment because there's this fear that, well, what about us? If you're focusing on women, then you're not focusing on men, and we lose something. But I think for men, part of the argument is that it's not that the pie is fixed. It's that when you empower women, the pie gets bigger. And when the pie gets bigger, there's more for everyone. And so explaining that to men, I think, is incredibly important, making sure that they feel involved and they feel like they have input. They don't necessarily need to be in the program or that sort of thing, but they do. I think we've done a better job in terms of women's empowerment programming in places like Afghanistan and others, where we've recognized that and we have included them in the conversation. And most of the time when you do that, it does make an incredible difference. And we've seen examples of that. So I think in places like Afghanistan, over the last 18 years, obviously, you have people all across the spectrum, right? You have very conservative people, you have people who are on, kind of on the opposite side, and you have people in the middle. But having those conversations and the number of conversations has increased over time. So you do see men who are champions of women's rights in Afghanistan, whether that's within their families and with their daughters and their relatives and their wives. And you see those champions at a national level as well. You also see detractors, and you see people who continue to think that it's a fixed pie and something's being taken away from them. So I think that effort is ongoing. People have to continue to have those conversations and kind of change that mindset. One interesting kind of anecdote is, as at the Bush Institute, we have a podcast called The Strategist, and just this past year, we had Afghanistan's first female fighter pilot since the Taliban era do an episode of the podcast with us. And she was saying that in her training, it was interesting to her that it was the older Afghan men who were her champions and her supporters and really kind of influenced her to keep going and, don't be kind of disappointed in people's reactions, like keep fighting the good fight. And it was the younger men who had the sense of, well, if a woman is doing this job, then how in the world could I do this job? Like it was as if their sense of dignity or their pride was hurt by having to do the same job that a woman was doing. And so I thought that was really interesting, that you have this kind of dichotomy. Now, obviously, you can't generalize across society. That was kind of one specific experience, but I say that just as a reminder that there are nuances that we don't always see or think about. That's not something I would have thought until I heard it from her, and then I was like, okay, well, I actually kind of understand that, because the older Afghan men come from my parents' generation, where of course women were involved in society. Of course this was something that women would do, and it's the younger ones who have lived through the Taliban era, have experienced 4 decades of war, who are saying, well, I don't know about this. That has taken a toll on just their view of society. Society has become, just in general, in Afghanistan, has become more conservative, unfortunately, since my parents' generation. So we just have to keep having those conversations, and even, one conversation with one person can make an immense difference. And I know that there are Afghan women doing that in Afghanistan today, because that's what it's going to take. It's going to take a critical mass of people having those conversations, changing people's minds in order for society to change and norms to change.
It is. I remind people it is a journey, not a sprint, right? Women have just been voting in America 100 years as we go into 2020 with the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage. And you have to remind people that, yes, this is a social movement. And William Pollard, in one of my favorite quotes, I think he was a minister of at least 100 years ago, that says, change is difficult, to not change is fatal. And because people are scared of change. Ooh, there's risk involved. And so here you have young men who are often, ooh, it's risk, these women may be taking our jobs or taking our power. And yes, I always love to use the pie gets bigger. There's there's plenty of pie as more people are finding jobs, better education. And I think that's part. And explaining that this is a journey. The first language, in 1848, Seneca Falls, was when the proposed language to let women vote was proposed, 1848. It did not pass till 1919, 1920. So I always say, okay, so in 1854, women could have said, oh, this is too hard, we quit, right? Or after the Civil War, when, oh, we're giving black men the right to vote, but now we're excluding the women, oh, we're going to quit. And so I think it is this persistence. And watching anything of social movements, I've always said I wish I had the democracy magic wand, right, to just make everything better. But it's education, but it's also conversation, that it is not threatening. Many countries that I work in, especially in Africa, I have more buy-in from young men, youth activists, than the older men that just, there was a great story in the Washington Post some time ago that I think it was women were running for office more often in Africa. And in one of the countries, Tanzania or Kenya, a man was interviewed by saying, well, if this woman is in the legislature, who's going to build my dung hut? Who's going to make my food? Who's going to carry the water, 20 miles a day? But I mean, you still have this, many women are just servants. So, it a journey, not a sprint, and we have to just keep improving and trying every time. And I've had women, some of the women I've worked with in Nigeria, one woman's husband left her because she wanted to run for office. So, I've had another where a woman in Jordan was running for parliament, and the great news was she was the top woman vote getter in Jordan and the youngest woman to serve. But the bad news, her husband was murdered 3 days before the election because people did not want a woman serving. So you can see why when I get a little upset sometimes with women in America that just go, oh, this is so hard. I go, now let me tell you what's hard in all of these places we've worked on what reality is. And not saying that we're perfect, but at least we still embrace a democracy, the democratic skills, right? That we do have freedom of speech and that we can keep trying to make things better. With this, Farhat and her colleague, Chris Walsh, have a new publication that just came out, Afghanistan, What is at Stake? So for those of you who would like more information, it's on public health, it's how the death rate, everything that measures social and economic health of a country.
You can find it on bushcenter.org.
Yes, of course, thank you for that. Do we have time for one more question? Okay, one more question, and then we'll talk about the preview of our next time together in 2 weeks. Oh, we have 2 more, even better. Yes, and then we'll go up here. And I'm losing. Oh, it's time for you, and your name?
I'm Trevor Provost.
Hi.
I'm a freshman here at KU. So my friend Brooklyn asked previously specifically about microloans and like what sort of policies best enable female empowerment and access to power structures. So a lot of futurist politicians, specifically presidential candidate Andrew Yang's been talking about the idea of a universal basic income, and he's been selling it almost as a feminist idea. By like reducing stigma by giving it to everybody so that way men don't feel excluded from the conversation. So I guess my question is like what sort of role do you feel a UBI would have in female empowerment and access to power structures?
Ooh, that's an interesting question. Yeah. I am definitely not an expert on that particular kind of policy solution, but I mean what speaks to me about that is the equality aspect of it, right? At least in this country, there's such a stigma around social welfare, just in general, and so I can see how giving kind of that the same amount to everyone could potentially make a difference, and could be the difference between going into debt for one hospital visit and not having to worry about that and have that weigh on you and impact all the other kind of aspects of your life. So I think I would probably do more research, but in theory, I mean, it sounds like something that could absolutely help women gain better access to education opportunities, economic opportunities, healthcare, all of the things that that women unfortunately kind of bear a disproportionate burden of accessing. Yeah.
Well, and I also think in many of the countries, there is no money.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, the poverty is so immense. And it's fascinating as I was listening to my guest speaker from Venezuela at the other Bush Institute a couple of weeks ago, that a lot of these people who have these social movements on, we want to help the poor people, right? We're going to help. And, Castro said that, all of this. And what happens is, no, it becomes corrupt and they keep the money, right? So they become the problem, even though originally it all sounds good on, we're going to give free stuff to people. So I think that it was very fascinating as we were listening on, especially Venezuela, and in a lot of these places, we're going to help everyone, and it ends up the people who take over help themselves. So I'll add that. And was there one more question? Last one. And your
Hi.
name, hello.
So I greatly appreciate the work you do. I was just reflecting, I worked 5 years in Saudi Arabia and I taught at an all-women's university. One thing that really surprised me was they felt sorry for me. So I went over there, I had no male guardian, no one to look after me. And so I kind of wanted to insert a little feminism in my lessons, but not be too imposing. So I wonder how you kind of navigate conversations when it's the women themselves who are resistant to the change. So they defended kind of the oppression that they were under.
Yeah, well, I think you sort of answered the question yourself in terms of having that discussion with them and really listening and understanding where they're coming from. In my mind, it's all about exposure, right? If you don't know what the alternative is, then it's a lot easier to accept your circumstances. But if you know the alternative and you know what's possible, but you choose what you have regardless, then that's a sense of empowerment too, right? You know what your options are, but you have the agency to make that decision. So I would say if they know the alternative and they're still deciding that this is best for them on an individual woman level, not necessarily a national level, but if each individual woman has this view that the current system is working for her, then she's entitled to that opinion. But what my concern is when you don't know what the alternative is and you don't have access to information, you don't have access to a free media, you're not able to see kind of how ambitious you could be and what life could be like. That's where I think you have severe issues for women and women's empowerment. But I think having that discussion is so important, and being able to hear from women themselves without judgment and without kind of preconceived notions and assumptions about what they should want. I think that's important, because we would react the same way if they said, oh, well, you should live your life this other way that I think is right for you. We'd say, well, I don't know about that, and they probably feel the same way when we say, well, you should want this thing that they actually don't want, So I say that just, again, in terms of having, empathy and compassion for other people and their lived experiences and what they want for their own lives, instead of kind of imposing our own view of what that should be. But Saudi Arabia is kind of an extreme example.
Yes, I think they're,
Yeah.
I read they're on a record level of executions this year.
Yeah. Well, and I will say just on that point, I mean, so much has been made about their ability to drive
Yes.
now after not having, had that access before. The current, kind of ruling party has talked about opening up society to women and the public space a lot more to women, but Saudi has such a long way to go when it comes to things like that, as you all know. The male guardianship law is still in effect, and as long as that's in effect, that impacts women's access to economic opportunities, to educational opportunities, all of these other things. So, I mean, I'm with you that access is incredibly important, and these things do need to change. But again, at an individual level, I think being able to have those conversations and listen is important.
Okay, in 2 weeks, my guest will be Susan Markham, who was the top gender person at USAID, and her department reviewed every project we were funding overseas to make sure there was gender equity. For instance, there was a power plant that we were helping assess in Jordan, and team looked at the plans, and there was no women's restroom. And she said, "Where's the women's restroom?" And they said, "We've never had women work here." So what comes first, the chicken or the egg? And so it is very interesting when you look in a different light. She is in Kenya this week. She has a contract with the United Nations Foundation and has put together a campaign manual. In fact, we were both in Moldova on UN projects, but at a different time, and now they've taken that model and they're teaching this in Kenya. So she will be very interesting to speak to. Oh, and she's a graduate of The Ohio State University, and I'm from Ohio. Ohio, so I'm sure we might have some Buckeye talk going on as well, since we kind of love Ohio. And with that, thank you so much for being at our inaugural conversation. I hope you enjoyed it. We are here to take some other questions, and thank you for spending time with us today. Thank you.